Let's take a look at fiscal policy. Before we begin our fiscal policy, I want to get into some mathematics here on multipliers. We've talked about multipliers already in this course. We've talked about multipliers with the banking system. So you might remember that there is a deposit multiplier. If we have a cash drain, we've got a money multiplier. So we've talked about multipliers before. We also talked about how velocity is related to multipliers. And ultimately, we found that when we increase consumption in the economy, it multiplies out quite quickly. So the same thing is going to happen with that initial purchase, i.e., when the government decides to purchase more goods and services, which is often how the government acts in order to get the economy back on track. So fiscal policy means government expenditures. But when the government spends a bunch of money, that's going to go to people. And those people are going to then spend that money. And then the people who receive that are going to spend that money again. Right? We talked about this idea with the velocity or quantity equation. And of course, we talked about this, as I just mentioned, with respect to the actual velocity and how it's related to expenditure on consumption. The more or the higher percentage of your economy that is consumption, the higher your velocity will be. And we have very similar equations to those that we saw in our fractional reserve, deposit multiplier, money multiplier, when we looked at how can commercial banks increase the money supply, right? So the multiplier effects are very similar mathematically. So we talk about this marginal propensity to consume, MPC. This is the fraction of income that people spend on consumption. So oftentimes, if we have an autarky, which means that there's no government, everybody's out for themselves, no government. If we have an autarky, oftentimes 75% on consumption is one of the numbers that economists like to use. And we can see that when we use that number, that our multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or in this case, 1 minus 0.75. So 1 over 1 minus 0.75 is going to equal 4. So imagine that the recessionary gap, which means how big the gap is between the natural level of output and our current level of output. So let's say that recessionary gap is $10 million. So we are currently $10 million in GDP below the natural level. Well, if that's the case and we have a multiplier of 4, then we can see that delta G, which is how much the government is going to need to spend, would be equal to $2.5 million. So 4 multiplied by 2.5 million will give us 10 million. So notice the government doesn't have to spend the exact amount that the economy is in a recession. Hey, the economy is currently $10 million below the natural level of output. Well, the government only needs to spend 2.5 million, and they're going to be able to, through the multiplier, bring the economy back to its natural level. We could also add in the imports. Here we see our denominator is 1 minus MPC plus MPI, which makes sense. Plus MPI because money that is spent on imports is going to go overseas. It's going to go into a different country, which means that it's going to multiply in that country. It's not going to be multiplying in Canada. It's been sent out of Canada. It's been sent out of the country. So there we see that plus MPI. So 1 minus MPC plus MPI. So now that we have that taken care of, why don't we go ahead and take a look at fiscal policy in a closed economy? Now, again, notice that immediately you should be able to begin the question without much thinking, because the first step is going to be given to you in the question. Remember, monetary policy means increase the money supply. There's your first step. Now, in fiscal policy, we're talking about increasing government expenditure. There's your first step. Aggregate demand is going to increase. AD equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Well, I should say C plus I plus G in this case because it is a closed economy. So government expenditure increases. There we go. There is our increase in the aggregate demand. Now, of course, we know that when there's an increase in the aggregate demand, we see that there is an increase in money demand. Remember that order of causation. We've already seen this. When there's an increase in money demand, that's going to increase the interest rate in the economy. And we know that the first thing that reacts to an interest rate is going to be the investment. Since we're in a closed economy, we don't have to worry about exchange rates. So investment is the first thing that reacts. Well, higher interest rates means lower investment. So now we're going to get crowding out of investment. Notice that in the short run, this model predicts crowding out of investment. In the long run, we also have that phenomenon. Right? So crowding out of investment is something that's happening in both cases, long run and short run. So here is our short run fiscal policy model when we have a closed economy. Let's move ahead to our flexible exchange rate. When we have a flexible exchange rate, we're going to see, as was mentioned earlier, we're going to see crowding out of investment and crowding out of net exports. And as we saw before in our monetary policy, when we have this world interest rate, RW, well, we know that at the end of this series of events, we're going to end up at RW. Right? So that's one of the things that we will see. So let's go ahead. We've got our increase in aggregate demand because of government expenditure. There it is, a nice big shift showing that multiplier effect. Money demand is going to increase because, hey, how are we going to buy all of that extra product? Well, we're going to want more money. So money demand goes up. Since the money demand is now higher, it means that our interest rate in Canada is higher. The world interest rate is lower. So what are Canadians going to want to do? Are they going to want to keep money in Canada at R1? Or are they going to want to send money overseas at RW? Well, the answer is they're going to want to keep money in Canada, which means that the net capital outflow is going to decrease. Right? R is greater than RW, net capital outflow decreases. We know that this is going to cause an increase in the exchange rate and a decrease in net exports. We also can see that the interest rate has gone up, and since the interest rate has gone up, domestic investment is going to decrease. So notice But because of this change here, we have a decrease in net exports and a decrease in investment. We have crowding out of net exports and crowding out of investment. So notice that our new position in this case for the aggregate demand is back where we began. So there's no permanent shift of our aggregate demand. And of course, since we've decreased our aggregate demand all the way back, well, that means the money demand is going to decrease as well, bringing us back to our W, where we always knew we would end up. So notice that when we have fiscal policy in a small open economy with a flexible exchange rate, that there is going to be no permanent change in the aggregate demand curve. Remember, it does not work. Next up is going to be our small open economy with a fixed exchange rate. Fiscal policy, I'm going to look at the aggregate demand curve first. We're going to increase that government expenditure, and with that, we're going to shift our AD. We're going to increase our aggregate demand, and of course, that's going to cause an increase in the money demand, which is going to drive up our interest rate. Now, because our interest rate has gone up, the first thing we want to look at is R being higher than RW. And we ask ourselves, okay, is this a fixed exchange rate or a flexible exchange rate? Oh, it's a fixed exchange rate. So I need to use that central bank to take care of this problem. R is greater than RW, which means that the net capital outflow is going to decrease, the exchange rate is going up, and the central bank says, whoa, the exchange rate is going up. I need to bring that exchange rate down. So in order to bring the exchange rate down, the central bank is going to increase the money supply. That's going to bring back down that exchange rate back to the fixed exchange rate, EF. And at the same time, increasing that money supply is also going to cause a decrease in the interest rate. Right? So we get back to RW. So this is going to happen all at the same time. We're going to get back to the fixed exchange rate and back to RW. Notice that this has caused a permanent shift in our aggregate demand. So what we see here is that when it comes to fiscal policy, the central bank and government need to be coordinated in their efforts. Fiscal policy will not work if the central bank is pursuing a flexible exchange rate. Fiscal policy will work in an open economy if the central bank is pursuing a fixed exchange rate. So even though these are independent institutions, right? The government is the government. The central bank is the central bank. They are separate institutions. They still need to coordinate their activities when there is an economic crisis. So again, we see our table, which summarizes the results of what we just went through. We see that in general, things work. However, monetary policy with a fixed exchange rate does not work. Remember, this was because that the central bank has to choose, am I going to control the money supply or am I going to control the exchange rate? They must choose. They can't do both. And with fiscal policy, we see that when we have a flexible exchange rate, it does not work because we get crowding out of net exports and crowding out of investment. So this summarizes our 6 scenarios. So these are detailed scenarios of how this model represents monetary and fiscal policy in these 3 different situations. So is active stabilization good? Well, yeah, in theory, it adds stability to the economy. Is it bad? Well, some say that there is a time lag that is not often accounted for. This adds evidence or adds an argument to not intervening in the economy for small fluctuations. So, just your normal business cycle, let the business cycle happen. No point in intervening. This time lag has to do with the real bureaucracy in an economy. Right? So there's a financial crisis, there's some sort of crisis, and the economy begins to go into a recession. So this is a large contraction. Now the governments and central banks need to react to this recession. So what are they going to do? Well, they can talk about what's going to be coming up, talk about some solutions. They can decide on some plausible solutions. Then they can write up some documentation. They can vote on the documentation after they debate things a little bit more. Then they have to vote again. And then they have to put the plan into action. And then they finally get some money out into the economy. All right. Well, all of this has taken time. And ultimately, the economy is probably already on its way to recovery. So, what if they decide on too big of a stimulus package? Well, that's going to push the economy into a large expansion. We don't want a large expansion. Right? So they can push the economy a little bit too far. Maybe the economy is already recovered. So this just creates inflation for no reason. So there could be problems with active stabilization. So it's important that the government and central bank act quickly if they're going to do something about the economy in a recession. Next up, we'll talk about automatic stabilization.